He may never have existed. No birth record, no confirmed grave, no contemporary chronicle written by someone who actually met him. And yet kings claimed to be his sons, armies marched under his name, and entire regions of Europe trembled at the legend of Ragnar Lothbrok. So who was he really? A flesh and blood Viking warlord who carved his name into history with iron and fire? Or something far more powerful, a carefully shaped myth designed to legitimize rule, unite factions, and intimidate enemies? To answer that, we have to step into the violent, fragmented world of the 9th century, where power was fragile, loyalty was transactional, and reputation could be more valuable than land. The Scandinavia of Ragnar's supposed lifetime was not a unified kingdom. It was a landscape of competing jarls, petty kings, shifting alliances, and blood feuds. Authority depended on charisma, military success, and the ability to distribute wealth. A leader who failed to bring back silver or slaves did not remain a leader for long. In such a world, stories were currency. A warrior's reputation traveled faster than ships. Songs, sagas, and skaldic poetry shaped how others perceived strength and legitimacy. This is the environment in which Ragnar Lothbrok emerges, not first as a documented historical figure, but as a story. The earliest written sources that mention him were recorded centuries after the events they describe. The Icelandic sagas, particularly the Ragnar's Saga Lothbrok, paint him as a larger-than-life hero, dragon slayer, conqueror of England and France, husband to shield maidens and queens, father to legendary sons like Bjorn Ironside, Ivar the Boneless, and Ubba. But here is the problem. Contemporary Frankish and Anglo-Saxon chronicles mention Viking leaders with similar exploits, yet they never clearly confirm a single unified figure named Ragnar Lothbrok. Instead, we find fragments. A Viking leader who attacked Paris in 845, known in some sources as Reginherus. Another figure associated with raids in England. Separate leaders active in different regions, possibly at different times. Historians have long debated whether these references point to one extraordinary individual or whether later storytellers combined several warlords into a single legendary persona. And this is where the power game begins. By the late 9th century, Scandinavia was undergoing political transformation. Regional rulers sought greater authority. Dynasties wanted legitimacy. Claiming descent from a legendary conqueror provided both. If you could trace your lineage back to Ragnar, you inherited not only a name, but a narrative of divine favor, unstoppable strength, and heroic destiny. Suddenly, myth became political capital. Consider the so-called Great Heathen Army that invaded England in 865. Anglo-Saxon sources describe leaders such as Ivar and Ubba as sons of Ragnar, supposedly seeking revenge for their father's execution by King Ella of Northumbria. The story is dramatic. Ragnar is captured, thrown into a snake pit, and dies laughing, predicting that his sons will avenge him. It is cinematic. It is powerful. It is also suspiciously perfect as propaganda. Revenge is a compelling justification for war. It transforms conquest into righteous retribution. If Ragnar truly died this way, it would explain the fury of the invasion. But the earliest English sources do not confirm the snake pit tale in detail. That vivid narrative appears later, shaped and expanded in saga literature. The more dramatic the death, the greater the emotional weight behind the invasion. Whether true or embellished, the story served a purpose. It unified disparate Viking forces under a shared cause and reinforced the idea that their leaders descended from a wronged hero. Even if Ragnar himself was partially fictional, belief in him was real, and belief can mobilize armies. There is also the weaponization of fear. In the 9th century, information traveled slowly, but stories traveled fast. A single brutal raid could be exaggerated into something apocalyptic by the time it reached the next kingdom. If a leader's name became associated with unstoppable violence, that name alone could weaken resistance before a single sword was drawn. Imagine coastal settlements hearing that Ragnar's sons were coming. Whether Ragnar was alive, dead, or partly fictional no longer mattered. The legend amplified terror. Fear reduces coordination. Fear fractures alliances. Fear forces rulers to pay tribute rather than risk annihilation. In that sense, Ragnar's name functioned like psychological warfare centuries before the term existed. A myth does not need to be accurate to be effective. It only needs to be believed. And if rival warlords began attaching their campaigns to the same legendary lineage, the myth would grow exponentially. Ragnar becomes not just a man, but a brand of violence, a symbol that magnifies the perceived power of every fleet that invokes him. Now consider another layer. Viking society valued genealogy. Lineage determined status. To claim descent from a legendary figure was not unusual. It was strategic. Over time, as oral traditions evolved into written sagas, storytellers may have merged multiple historical figures into one archetype, the ideal Viking king. Ragnar becomes that archetype. Fearless in battle, cunning in strategy, favored by the gods, yet flawed enough to remain human. The dragon-slaying episode in some versions of the saga feels almost mythic, echoing older heroic traditions. This blending of mythic motifs with semi-historical events suggests that Ragnar's identity was shaped intentionally to fit a narrative pattern. He is less a documented commander and more a symbol of the Viking Age itself. That does not mean there was no real warlord behind the legend. It is entirely plausible that a powerful raider led the siege of Paris in 845. Frankish sources describe the attack in detail, including ransom payments made to force the Vikings to leave. A leader of that expedition would have been formidable, wealthy, and widely known. But whether that man's name was Ragnar Lothbrok, or whether later storytellers attached that name to him, remains uncertain. And uncertainty is where myth thrives. As Scandinavian polities consolidated into larger kingdoms in the 10th and 11th centuries, rulers needed shared heroic origins. A legendary ancestor helped bind rival factions into a common identity. Instead of competing regional stories, you had one dominant narrative. A founding hero whose sons shaped the Viking expansion across the British Isles and beyond. The more fragmented the historical record, the easier it was to craft that narrative. Over time, Ragnar's sons also became semi-legendary figures. Bjorn Ironside is associated with Mediterranean raids. Ivar the Boneless appears in Irish and English sources as a cunning and ruthless leader. Ubba features in battles recorded in Anglo-Saxon chronicles. These men likely existed in some form, but labeling them all as brothers, sons of a single father, creates cohesion. It turns scattered raids into a dynastic saga. It simplifies complex geopolitical movements into a family story. And family stories are easier to remember and to believe. The power of Ragnar's legend lies not in clear documentation but in narrative utility. For enemies, invoking his name amplified fear. For allies and descendants, it amplified prestige. For later writers, it provided a dramatic lens through which to interpret the chaotic Viking Age. And in medieval politics, perception was often more important than precision. Even centuries later, Scandinavian identity was shaped by these heroic sagas. The idea of fearless seafaring ancestors conquering foreign shores became a foundational myth. Ragnar embodies that image. Whether he personally commanded every raid attributed to him matters less than the fact that people believed he had. So was Ragnar Lothbrok a myth? The answer is not simply yes or no. He was likely rooted in real 9th century warlords whose exploits echoed across Europe. But the Ragnar we know, dragon slayer, snake pit martyr, father of avengers, is a constructed figure, a composite, a political instrument shaped by oral tradition, dynastic ambition, and cultural memory. In that sense, Ragnar represents something deeper than an individual biography. He represents how power manufactures legacy. A sword can win a battle. A story can win generations. By turning a possibly obscure warlord into a near-mythical ancestor, Scandinavian rulers gained continuity and legitimacy, and by repeating his tale, poets ensured that his influence outlived any single kingdom. Even modern portrayals, from novels to television, continue this pattern. Ragnar remains magnetic because he stands at the intersection of history and legend. We are drawn to figures who blur that line. They feel larger than life, yet anchored in reality. And perhaps that is the final truth about Ragnar Lothbrok. There is one more reason Ragnar matters, and it has nothing to do with dragons or snake pits. It has to do with timing. The 9th century was not just an age of raiding. It was an age of transition. Scandinavia was shifting from loose tribal power structures to early state formation. That shift creates tension. Old elites resist centralization. New rulers need stronger narratives. In that exact moment, a unifying heroic ancestor becomes politically priceless. If multiple warlords were active across England, Francia, and Ireland, combining them into a single legendary progenitor would simplify power. Instead of fragmented regional heroes, you get one origin story, one bloodline, one mythic source of legitimacy. That consolidation mirrors the political consolidation happening on the ground. The legend grows as kingdoms grow, and the more successful the Viking expansions become, the more useful Ragnar's name becomes. Even if he started as a real commander, his legend would have expanded naturally with every victory attributed to his sons. Success reinforces myth. Myth reinforces authority. Authority attracts followers. It is a self-feeding cycle. By the time saga writers put these stories into writing centuries later, they were not inventing from nothing. They were crystallizing generations of political storytelling. And once written, the legend became even harder to challenge. What began as reputation became identity. What began as identity became history. That is why the question, did Ragnar really exist, may be the wrong one. A more important question is, who needed Ragnar to exist? And the answer is clear. Ambitious leaders, consolidating kingdoms, and a society in the middle of transformation. In that sense, Ragnar was not just a warrior. He was a solution to a political problem. Whether he existed exactly as described is almost secondary. What matters is that his name became a vessel for ambition, identity, and authority. In a world where literacy was limited and chronicles were scarce, stories built empires. Ragnar may have been a man. He may have been several men combined. Or he may have been a myth constructed to serve power. But the legend itself was real. It moved armies. It justified invasions. It shaped dynasties. And in the brutal chessboard of the Viking Age, that might have been the greatest power of all.